Hello everybody, this is Nahaz, and men lie, women lie, but stats, well, we'll have to see. Maybe I should retitle this series. So I just released one of these episodes yesterday, talk about the 6.87 patch notes, and I wanted to do another quick video today to react to the Manila Major invites that were announced by Valve earlier this morning. So obviously the big surprise to anybody that's been following this is that there were 12 teams that were directly invited by Valve to participate in the Manila Major in early June. This was a surprise because, of course, in the Frankfurt Major and the Shanghai Major, we only saw 8 directly invited teams, and then the remaining 8 teams determined by regional qualifiers. Now, the actual identity of the teams on this list, I don't think comes as a surprise to anybody. When you look at the top 4 teams, Secret, Liquid, EG, and MVP, these are the teams that pretty much everybody, including me, had listed as locks. Despite showing some weakness recently at the Starladder Invitational and a little bit of unevenness in their online play, MVP had a top 4 finish at Shanghai. They won that Dota Pit LAN that was immediately after Shanghai. I think everybody thought that they deserved to be included. The next line, I think Wings, after their very strong performance at ESL1 Manila last weekend, Vici Gaming Reborn, after winning the Starladder Invitational over Navi, LGD, OG Alliance. I think everybody expected them to be included as well. The debate 12 hours ago, when we all thought that there were only going to be 8 directly invited teams, was largely over which of Fnatic, OG, Complexity, or Alliance should get the last 2 spots. And that was a very tricky discussion. All right. Eternal Envy, for example, released a blog on this yesterday saying that he thought that Valve should value performance over a longer period of time, which would tend to favor OG, which won the Frankfurt Major, and Alliance, who were the only team to win 2 premier international LAN events on the previous patch 6.86. There are a lot of other people that felt that Fnatic and Complexity should be invited by virtue of having beaten OG and Alliance head-to-head at the Shanghai Major, as well as being a little bit more active and successful at online and LAN events since that most recent major. So by inviting 12 teams, we really avoid that debate entirely. Navi and LGD are kind of the 2 surprise inclusions, but I will say, back when I was assuming, like everybody else, that there were only going to be 8 teams, I actually wrote an article last week for ESPN talking about Manila Major invite scenarios going into the ESL1 event the previous weekend. I actually mentioned in that article that Navi and LGD were really the only 2 teams that survived at the periphery of the discussion that had a chance to earn invites to the major, or at least be awarded invites by Valve, without necessarily winning at Manila in the previous weekend. So I do feel good about that. I feel like if it had ever crossed my mind that Valve might invite 12 teams, that these actually probably would have been the obvious 12. And as we go into the video and get a little bit deeper talking into cases for 12 teams, that's going to be the single biggest factor in favor of 12 teams, is that with 12 teams, it's a lot more obvious where the cutoff should be. Okay, so the regional qualifiers, the downside of this system is that when you look at the regional qualifiers, there's only going to be 1 team invited from each region. So these are now winner take all. There's no, the second place team is going home just like everybody else. And that's going to make for some big time drama in these qualifiers. You look at Americas. Shazam actually beat this Digital Chaos team the last time the 2 faced each other in a series. So a lot of people, when they look at the Americas region, they see Digital Chaos now has 2 players from the secret roster that won the previous Shanghai Major. They are not at all a shoo-in to get out of this Americas qualifier. You look at the China qualifier. We're actually going to talk later in the video. I think EHOME and Newbee actually have an argument that they might have been invited, should have been invited rather, ahead of LGD. So you look at one of those 2 teams is definitely going to be coming home. Europe, you look at this, one of the very strange things about the European qualifier, this is actually the CIS qualifier plus no Diggity. Okay, that's kind of the really weird thing. You look at these teams, they are overwhelmingly out of the CIS region. I've talked recently in an interview that I did with Starladder, along with a couple tweets and periphery mentions in some recent videos, that I was very concerned with the CIS region. There is a ton of talent in this region, but because of all of the roster turmoil that occurred largely at the last minute, it's very hard to tell which of these teams are deserving ahead of the others. Well, they're all going to duke it out in the qualifier, and at most one of them is going to get to go to Manila. So that's going to be, Europe is going to be, once again, in my opinion, probably the most competitive of the 4 regions. And you look at the SEA qualifier. One of the things that is going to concern me, and we'll talk about this a little later, is it's fine to say, okay, there are a lot of good, there are a lot of deserving teams. We should invite 12 rather than 8. But that argument, that logic is predicated on the fact that you could identify which 12 should be invited. I actually think there's a very good chance that under this system, MVP Phoenix would not be playing at the Shanghai Major. So that's a big concern. And when you look at some of these SEA teams, obviously lots of talent, but very, very volatile online play, all of these, again, all but one of these teams is going to be going home. So just before I go into my own views on this, I at least wanted to put up what Valve gave as the justification on the blog where they released the invites this morning. Basically what they're saying is a lot of things changed during the year, from team compositions to new results in LAN tournaments. And the biggest point I think they make is we think it's very important for the ecosystem as a whole if third-party LAN tournaments during the year are able to have a lasting impact. I think that that's right. I think that one of the things that all of us had been concerned about going into this major system is third-party LAN tournaments kind of being crowded out. And so in that respect, if you are thinking about promoting third-party LAN tournaments, it actually makes a lot of sense having more direct invites and fewer qualifiers. I'm not convinced that the way Valve did this is actually that beneficial to third-party events. That's another issue that we'll get to a little later on. But I mean, this justification on paper, it's not like I'm going to sit here and rant and say, evil Valve. This justification on paper is something that I very much believe in. I'm not convinced that the way that they've executed these invites is actually completely compatible with this stated philosophy. But again, we'll get into that. So here's the case for 12 teams as I see it. This slide is completely ad hoc, admittedly. This was pretty much Noxville and I got together yesterday. And by the way, at the bottom of this slide are links to his website and his Twitter handle. If you enjoy this video series and you're not already following Noxville, please do. A lot of the results, the numbers that I use in these videos come from his computations. He has it all set up and automated very nicely, and no need for me to reinvent the wheel. Anyway, what we did, this is totally arbitrary, but we set up a very off-the-cuff point system where you get points for ranking high in various statistical metrics. So you get points for top 4, top 8, top 6, and top 10 in the various statistical metrics. And the other thing, that 3 of these statistical metrics that we're weighting are actually the same. They're actually all ELO, but they're over various time horizons. So they're your current rate, your active average, so basically since the birth of your team with your current roster, the weekly average, and the monthly average. The idea is a lot of the discussion, a lot of the argument surrounding invites, what had been over what time horizon should results be considered, and how do you weight past results versus current results. So this was kind of our attempt to weight results over various time horizons. The other thing we did is we gave points based on where you finished in Shanghai. So you got 6 points for top 8 finish, 12 points for top 6, 18 points for top 4, reflecting the fact that we all thought that the top 4 teams would be pretty much locked. And you got points for LAN events that occurred in the interim between the end of the Shanghai Major and and Manila Major invites being announced. So this is one of the things, for example, the interim LAN events. This is one of the things that Alliance could argue that they actually don't get credit for their win at StarLadder Season 13. This is StarLadder here under this entry is actually the StarLadder Invitational, but that's offset by the fact that Alliance are still getting credit via their ELO ratings for that StarLadder win. So that's why they're ranking in the top 5 in active average as well as monthly average. So I thought this was at least a reasonable compromise. Although again, it's very important. A lot of people have this idea in their heads that I'm advocating for some kind of automatic selection process. Nothing could be farther from the truth, guys. I'm a big fan of college sports. I'm a fan of college football. The BCS in college football, which was an automated system, was an absolute disaster. Everybody hated it. I hated it. The last thing I think should be the case is that we should be deciding based on some kind of like automatic or statistical ranking system. That said, what I do think that this slide illustrates very well is just how tough a decision it was going to be if you had cut the field off at 8 teams. So I think, again, the top 5, Liquid, Secret, EG, MVP, and then given their recent performance, Fnatic, I think the top 5, any sane criteria, okay, would have these 5 teams included. And that's, I'm not ripping on Jackie here. I know he, in his blog yesterday, argued that Alliance and OG should actually be considered ahead of Fnatic. I still think when you look at the whole of the data, Fnatic are a team that ought to be safely in. The big problem is if you were going to invite Wings and Vici Gaming Reborn to reward their performance at recent LAN events, which I do think is very important, you are only going to be able to take one of these 3 teams, Alliance, OG, and Complexity. And that's a very, very close call. You can jigger around with these numbers. You can reweight them however you want. That is going to be a very tough call. By inviting 12 teams, okay, really the only questionable team on that invite list in terms of if you take the top 12 most deserving teams, the only questionable invite on that list is really LGD. I do think both EHOME and Newbee have a legitimate beef, and that beef is accentuated by the fact that one of those 2 teams is definitely going to be going home from the Chinese regional qualifier. Other than that, though, I think it's much, much easier and it's much easier to make a fair and objective cutoff with 12 teams this time around rather than 8. So that's the big, to me, benefit. Here's to me what I really worry about. If you go back to MVP Phoenix was a top 4 finisher at the Shanghai Major, and you ask yourself, okay, would MVP Phoenix, if you had invited 12 teams to Shanghai rather than 8, and you'd have 1 team from each qualifier going to Shanghai, would MVP Phoenix have made it to Shanghai? And I actually think the answer to that could very, very easily have been no. You go back and you look at just how close it was between MVP Phoenix and Mineski in the regional qualifier. MVP Phoenix were very nearly eliminated in the group phase of the Shanghai Major SEA qualifiers. They actually had to play a tiebreaker game in which they were down to almost 10K gold at the 25-minute mark to Mineski. This was, by the way, this Mineski squad had 4 out of the 5 same members as the Mineski squad that competed at the Frankfurt Major. So this is not, this is not some kind of unheard of team. This is a team that arguably was heavily favored coming into this game and did have a huge lead as the game went on. MVP Phoenix pulled a crazy comeback and just were able to squeak into the top 4 spots into that playoff to determine who went to Shanghai. So again, this is something that I mentioned before, and I'm going to probably mention again in this video. It's fine to say the pool, and this is something I'd said in previous videos, the pool of good teams in Pro Dota 2 right now is much, much deeper than it has been anytime in the last 3 to 4 years, anytime since Dota became Dota 2. We have incredible competitive depth in the scene right now. The question, though, is, can you really, before the fact, especially given that we're going to be playing both the qualifiers and the major on a new patch that was released only a week before the major qualifiers are going to begin, can you really identify who are the best teams before the fact? I worry that a team like MVP Phoenix that really, of all the things that went wrong at the Shanghai Major, MVP Phoenix was one of the big factors that to me really saved that event. They were a huge Cinderella story, almost to the same extent that CDEC were at TI5. I worry that a team like that under this system is a lot more likely than people think to actually have been excluded from a major tournament. Okay. The other thing, I think you have to question this LGD invite over Newbee and EHOME. So, ELO, I don't want to emphasize this too much because obviously any individual statistical ranking system is going to be flawed. But if you do look at monthly average ELO ratings, Newbee and EHOME are both pretty substantially ahead of LGD. This is based on all matches played, including LAN and online. If you just look at this month's result, both Newbee and EHOME won their most recent head-to-head series against LGD. This is with the current roster. Newbie beat them 2-1. I believe EHOME 2-0'd them, although they had 2-0'd EHOME in a previous series, so that may be kind of canceled out. The biggest thing that I worry about is it's pretty clear if you look at the head-to-head records, okay? LGD has not been dominant against teams in their region. They barely have a winning record against IG Vitality. They have an even record 2-2 against EHOME. They're 1-2 against Newbie. That was the best of 3 head-to-head result that I mentioned a second ago. Their results, to the extent that their results are impressive, are almost all coming from the Starlighter Invitational. And there's a reason that Invitational is a part of the name. LGD were invited to that event. It wasn't that they earned a spot at the event over Newbie or over EHOME. They were directly invited. And this is an event that iLeague and Imba TV have a big role in. So they were directly invited to this event. And I just kind of worry that by giving an event, I know I've said, and I continue to believe, that the Dota that was played at this event was at easily a high enough level that the results should definitely matter. But by inviting LGD over Newbie and EHOME, you get into this uncomfortable gray area where this was a tournament that was both an invitation-only affair, and invitations were decided on by these entities that may actually be tied to teams. And I worry a little bit about that precedent. I think that that gets us into a very, I'm not promoting any kind of conspiracy theory here, guys. This is not designed to start some kind of stupid drama. I'm just saying this gets us into a rather uncomfortable gray area. Newbie are actually the team that have earned a spot in a LAN event. And what happens if Newbie goes on to win, if Newbie loses in the qualifiers, but they go on to win, say, the Epicenter finals in May, right? That's going to make me really uncomfortable. And it's going to, there's a very real question. Do they get credit for that then when TI invites come out, right? So going to 12 teams in the very short term, it makes it easier to draw a fairer cutoff. But I worry about the precedent, and I worry a lot about this last LGD invite. Okay, so kind of big picture. All right, I wanted to at least present the arguments in pro versus con form, because a lot of people when they see this video are probably going to assume that it's going to be me ranting about how Valve sucks, and I don't think that that's right. I think Valve looked at the situation and they tried to come to a fair decision. I don't necessarily agree with the way they did it, but I don't think it's like, Valve being money hungry or Valve just grubbing for compendium sales either. I think Valve tried to do something fair here. I just don't necessarily agree with what they ultimately decided to do. So the pros. Cutoffs are much, much clearer. In this particular example, if you look at teams, how they stand right now, cutoffs are way clearer with 12 teams than they would be with 8 teams. Modulo that LGD invite, which again, having seen LGD at the Starlighter Invitational, I personally can't argue with that too much, but I do think EHOME and Newbie would have a beef if I'm them. You do ensure, and this is a big one, I had in the past advocated that direct invites should be region blind. And I'm still very much in that camp. But I was a little bit concerned looking at the 8-team invite scenarios that CIS would not be represented. And CIS is a really difficult region to evaluate right now. Because number one, they've had all this recent roster chaos. They've had all this turnover. They obviously have huge talent in that region. And historically, they've been lumped together with Western Europe when you talk about the qualifiers. So CIS was at very, very real risk of kind of getting hosed with an 8-team direct invite scenario. And I think one of the nice things about the 12-team invite situation is that Navi, who'd been playing very, very well recently, if you actually watch their games, they may be playing even a little bit better than their results would indicate. They get represented, and most of the teams in the actual regional qualifier are CS teams. So I think that that's one kind of benefit to this, even though I do think in a perfect world, oh God, no pun intended, invites would be region blind. I do think that one of the big benefits of this system is that you see those CIS teams get a fair chance to actually prove which of these talented squads does deserve to be there. You also take into account, this was Valve's stated philosophy, and I really agree. You take into account LAN results. You also take into account online results. If you look at the composition of the European regional qualifier, for example, if you look at Navi getting invited, it's pretty clear that Dream League results mattered in terms of the Dota 2 teams' evaluations of these teams. And I think that's important. I think it's important for us to be saying, look, other tournaments matter. It's just not all, it's not going to be just 4 majors in the year and we forget everything else. I think online matches ought to matter. Okay. I had said in many of my previous invite projections that I thought that LAN events should matter a lot more, but I do think it's a nice side benefit that you get to take online play into account. And again, you know, I tend to not think too much about this, but you know, this is the very first thing that I did when I saw the invites this morning, even though, yes, Nahaz was left, okay? The very first thing that I did was message Swindles and message Kelly and say, look, you know, I had been questioning whether Alliance would be invited. I've been questioning whether Complexity would be invited. I am thrilled for these teams getting invited. They have worked their butts off. They played some great Dota. They are deserving of competing in a major. So you know what? I'm going to step back for a minute and allow myself to be a fan rather than an analyst and say, I am happy that Navi and Complexity and Alliance are going to be in Manila. As an analyst, I still question that decision, but as a fan, it's great. And ultimately, hey, you know, this should be about the fans, okay? Cons. Guys, transparency is important, all right? I maybe had gone a little bit too heavy into the Joe Lunardi stuff in my previous videos. I'd spent a lot of time projecting Manila Major invites, and you know, a lot of that ended up being kind of toss it out the window because it ended up being 12 rather than 8. But I do think transparency and clarity are really, really important. Guys, the NBA is not going to add a lower bracket to the playoffs because Steph Curry got hurt and everybody wants to see him playing in the finals in the interest of TV ratings, okay? It is important that we have a clear set of rules for these tournaments. This is esports has already grown and is continuing to grow. We have multiple millions of dollars here at stake. I do think both the teams and the fans deserve to know ahead of time what the rules are going to be. And you know, as much as certain people might say, oh, haha, Nahaz, you spent all this time, you know, making videos talking about who's going to be invited. Haha, who the hell do you think you are? You know, that to me is content that appeals to a lot of fans in other sports. And I want to make that kind of content for Dota because I think it appeals to people that might be fans of Dota that might not necessarily, like me, have time to play all that much Dota. Okay, I think that kind of content is important. And yeah, I mean, I do think I'd like to be able to do that. I'm probably going up to TI6. I probably won't talk about the TI6 invites that much until they're released. You look at, this is the single biggest argument to me outside of that. 4 of the top 6 teams at the Shanghai Major were qualifier teams. And so myself and a lot of other people had been assuming that fewer teams would be directly invited to the next major and to TI. Valve actually went in the other direction and said, okay, you think that there are all these teams out there that compete, let's actually invite more teams. Let's make sure that more teams that have been doing well at recent events are going to be playing at this major. Again, the critical question to me is, did we really know which teams a priori were good and were deserving? Was it that obvious if you had extended, okay, the direct invite list to 12 for Shanghai? Was it that obvious ahead of time that MVP Phoenix was better than Team Spirit, for example? I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. One of those 2 teams probably wouldn't have been there, okay? And would we have gotten it right? I'm not sure the answer. Would Wings, if every tournament did this, okay, if every tournament started to directly invite 75% of the field, would Wings have been invited to ESL 1 Manila? Would they have been playing in that event? I don't think so, okay? So I do think that it is important for competitive balance that qualifiers do happen and that they determine, I do think 50% or more of the field for a tournament like this is the right number. I think that there's an argument in terms of fairness to having a little flexibility in determining bids, but going from 8 to 12 at sort of no notice, 48 hours before open qualifiers anyway begin, I just don't think that that's the way forward in terms of managing the growth of the scene. The other thing, I so completely agree with what Valve said in their statement about the importance of third-party events and placing emphasis on other LAN results, not just the most recent 3. I am completely on board with that. The problem is, when you look at what we do to promote these events, look at what I did on the panel and as host at the Starlight Invitational. You try to spin narratives. That's how you sell these events to fans, is you spin narratives about why they matter. Nobody knows how much money, you get for winning the World Series. It's important because you won the World Series, or it's important because you won the NBA title, right? We can't necessarily get by with saying, oh, the Starlight Invitational, $100,000 prize pool, that's why this tournament matters. That doesn't matter to a lot of fans. Fans want to know how this tournament affects the major picture, how this tournament affects these teams going forward from here. And those narratives, we can't use those narratives as a part of the sales pitch for why you should be watching Dota 2 tournaments unless we know why and how and which of these events are going to matter. And that's the kind of the last point. Which of these events should count? Okay, should the Starlighter Invitational, who had no qualifiers at all, much less open qualifiers, should those events matter? I think given the level of Dota played at that event, it is certainly fair to take them into account, but you also can't deny that the mere fact that LGD was invited to that event potentially played a big role in them appearing on the list ahead of Newbee and ahead of EHOME. So I continue to believe, I think a lot of people probably expected me to be up in arms about this and raging at Valve. I can't be that up in arms about it, because when you look at the 12 teams that are going to be competing, I have a hard time, at least 11 out of the 12, you look at and you say that team deserves to be there, okay? I can't argue too much about that. What I can argue, and I will continue to argue, is that going forward, the best way to grow the scene, the best way to make events more friendly for third-party organizers, the best way to grow our fan base is transparency and clarity. Like it or not, when you look at people watching ESPN and what kind of coverage they give you of the NFL, of the NCAA tournament, of other great sports, a lot of that coverage is based on who's going to make the tournament, who's going to make the playoffs. I really, if all of a sudden the NFL came out today and said, you know what, guys, this year we're going to have 2 more playoff teams. Imagine what the reaction would be from the fan base. Imagine if in August, the Yankees looked like they weren't going to make the playoffs, so Major League Baseball said, you know what, we're going to add a playoff spot. All right. I can tell you, as a long time, I was going to Major League Baseball games at Busch Stadium in diapers. All right. As an MLB fan for my entire life, the reaction from that fan base would be nothing short of nuclear. Okay. I think you need clarity. People that follow traditional sports expect it. Esports fans, I think, have the right to expect it. It helps all of the stories. It helps our ability to promote these teams. It helps the growth of the scene. That said, I am incredibly excited to see these qualifiers. I think it's going to be a great event. I think the Manila Major is going to be an amazing tournament when you look at everything that I've heard from my friends that were at ESL 1 Manila this previous weekend. It was completely unprecedented in terms of just how fantastic the crowd was, just how fantastic the fans were. I think Manila is going to be every bit that good and then some, and I can't wait to talk about it some more with you guys in weeks to come. This is Nahaz, and I will talk to you soon.